Little Blinking Light Podcast. Welcome back. I'm Richard Pyatt. Roger Furwarn's here with AE Tech Design. Boy, I wonder if there's ever been a survey done of how many hours of sleep have been lost by people laying awake, worried about their data and having backed it up, and how safe that is. You probably hear about that a lot.
We do hear about that a lot. You know, one of the things that business and organizational leaders think a lot about is how to protect their environments. And they are becoming savvy enough to realize that it could have a real impact. And for those that are listening that maybe really haven't thought about it as much, I hate to call it, but this might be your wake-up call to realize that it is an important thing. And we do need to be in a situation where we're thinking about it.
So when we talk about backup strategies, what do we really mean?
So backup strategies is actually a little bit more than that. And in the industry, it's called BCDR, Backup, Continuity, and Disaster Recovery.
Yeah.
And really, if you think about it, the whole goal of a backup is to have it so that you can restore it or recover from a disaster. So when you talk about a backup strategy, you really need to think about the whole process, not just did I capture the data, but how am I going to get back in operational as an organization?
Okay.
And there are many different kinds of threats to your data. And a lot of people, the first one that comes to mind is hackers. It's a very real thing of organizations of all size. And I'm sure in future podcasts, we'll talk a little bit about the cybersecurity implications of that. But when we think about hackers, they're going to want to do two things. They're going to want to ransom your data, which means take it away from you being able to access it. And then the other one is potentially use that data for their own personal gain of some sort. So if you think about it from the first standpoint, this is where backup and recovery come into play. If you can recover the data that somebody has ransomed from you, you would also be able to not have to pay them a ransom. So when we talk about ransomware and those types of things, we're going to be able to take that data and recover it and be operational without having any implications of the original hacker. Now, there may be other implications. We'll talk about that at a future podcast. But that's one piece of that. So that's one kind of disaster that you may experience. Another kind, and for those in the IT industry, we know it all too well, hardware failure.
Yeah.
You have something fail on you, and every system out there is designed to work to some level of reliability. Not perfect. We as humans aren't perfect, and therefore we can't develop perfect systems. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we're accounting for hardware failure. And as we talk about some of the rules around backup strategy, we'll talk about why that piece is important. So hardware failure could be a very real thing. And then you have the threat of something happening in your environment. Just this week, we had a tornado pass through here in Portage, Michigan. And that I think was really an eye opener as the city recovers and as people assess the damage and what that's done. I personally know of businesses that were directly hit by the tornado.
Sure.
To the point where they can't even enter the premise of their business. Like, there is a caution tape, and the building is in a state where it will fall down at any moment now. And because of that, they still need to be able to access their data. So it's thinking of things like that too, where something happens, fire, you may have, this is all too common, unfortunately, you may have 3 feet of water in your server room. So you now have data that is now underwater. It's probably not looking good for the data. Right. So it's thinking through, something happening to your environment, something happening to, outside nefarious actor, like a hacker of some sort, and then something happening to the hardware itself, are just some of the many things that can happen to the data itself. And so when we talk about backup strategy, we then want to implement something called the 3-2-1 rule for the data retention. So the 3-2-1 rule is pretty straightforward. It's you need to have 3 copies of your data at a minimum of 2 different devices. So this one's really important.
Ooh.
Two different devices. We've seen so often people say, oh yeah, I have a backup of my data. Wait a second, the backup is on the exact same device as the first device. So again, we get into that hardware failure, or hacker compromises that piece of equipment. Well, guess what? They got not only the original data, but the backed up data as well. And the one stands for having it at least one site remote to it. A lot of times this is the cloud. Doesn't always have to be though. Some organizations, it may just be another location. Some organizations will actually change that to more like a 3-2-2 rule with 2 different locations. Maybe one is the cloud, maybe one is just another one of their locations that they're backing their data up to. And the reason why an organization would look at it that way is, again, we're going to not only talk about the strategy to protect the data, but we're now going to talk about the strategy to restore the data and what those goals are.
So say that again. 3-2-1. 3 copies of your data on 2 different devices. What's the one now?
It is one. It has to be at least one off-site location.
Off-site. Okay. So when we talk about the cloud, for example, the idea would be that you could go log in somewhere from another device and access that cloud data. But if a hacker, for example, has your original devices, they may have gotten into the cloud too.
And that's an important thing. And that's definitely something that you need to figure out in your backup strategy. One of the things that has become very important in the industry is something called immutability. And what that means is that nobody has the power to delete the data if it is compromised. So, for example, for our clients and for our own data here at AE Tech, we actually have immutable backup. And that means that even if, and we take lots of precautions along the way to make sure that these systems are actually disconnected from each other. And there's different strategies for that, probably a little bit outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. But we make sure that they're disconnected, they're authenticated differently, they're on different kinds of platforms, so that whatever was used to compromise platform A doesn't give them a path back to platform B where backup data is being stored. But then the other important thing is, let's say a cloud backup was compromised. There is actually a time limit on it that you set as part of your backup strategy. Maybe, for example, it's 30 days. 30 days of immutability means even if I say delete it, it's going to take 30 days before it actually gets deleted. Oh. And that's really helpful, because if somebody compromises something, you actually have some time to get the data back or prevent it from being deleted because of that immutability. So, that's part of what we also talk about in the strategy is how are we going to make it, if something does happen, you do have a compromise, how are we going to make it so that people can't access it? And that's something that's oftentimes overthought.
Yeah. Well, and that example that you described is also applicable to the other examples you cited: fire, tornado, etc., some kind of disaster. It is separated. You're still able to get to it in all likelihood, probably.
Yeah, but then we get into the recovery portion.
Yeah.
And this is going to be an important piece, because now you have what we call recovery objectives. So some organizations would go, okay, if my data was compromised, I could wait 24 hours. My business or my organization could be 24 hours without that data, or without those servers that may run and operate the software that operates my business. So 24 hours may be the objective. And then we're going to pair that with the amount of data and being on the internet to determine, okay, if they had a compromise or they had a hardware failure or some sort of natural disaster, we're going to then take that information and go, okay, based on that and the speed of the average internet connection that that client would most likely use, they're going to be able to recover that data within the 24 hours or not. But then we have organizations that go, well, 4 hours that's even pushing it for us, but we could do 4 hours. And so that becomes a different type of strategy, because depending again on the amount of data or the complexity of their server environment or their cloud server environment, 4 hours could be a really long time. And then we even have organizations like 1 hour. You have 1 hour to get us our data back and us up and running. And we have strategies to get an organization, if their corporate headquarters was just demolished, we have the ability to have them back up and running within 1 hour based on the design of that system. So that's an important piece to consider. The other one is, so too often we're talking with clients that aren't realizing that they need to back up the stuff that's in the cloud too.
Yeah.
Just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean it's protected.
So that reminds me of a scenario I saw once. An organization, I suppose it would be considered small by definition. They backed up their server a couple of times a week on an external drive, that a couple of them, switch them out, back up, next time switch them out, back up. And the boss would take that drive home with them. So that's the different location part of what you're saying. But it sounds a little archaic to do it that way, but that probably is one option.
It is one option, and it is still a viable option depending on your tolerance for data loss still. And for example, a lot of times organizations will say that the data must be so many miles away from the original location, because in the event of a tornado or the event of a hurricane or an earthquake, or you feel wildfires that are become unfortunately all too prevalent, organizations then need to go, okay, is the boss's home far enough away for that? The other thing that you're potentially opening yourself up to, and we need to talk a little bit about, is the encryption of that backup. You've now backed up your entire environment with all of that sensitive user data, and with breaches becoming all too common, that's a real problem. If boss has his hard drive, it's unencrypted backup data, somebody steals that backup, guess what? They may now have tons and tons of user data because it wasn't properly encrypted. So there's a lot to think about with those types of strategies. It can be a viable strategy, but there are other ways to do it that may be more viable, or considerations that need to be thought about.
Well, that could open up a whole new vulnerability. Maybe there is no natural disaster or issue, but that backup gets compromised.
It is, that's one of those things. If the backup is compromised, that is something you have to protect your backup as much as you protect the original data, because it's an exact copy of the original data. So not protecting the backup, that's all too common, but it's actually something that you have to take into serious consideration.
And if you have a large organization, you're not taking that backup home.
You're not taking it home. And, there are actually services that have armored vehicles that come and pick up backups and then take them to secure facilities where they are tagged, and the data is protected at a level with armed personnel and things like that. I mean, those places exist too. And we can even talk about that as part of a backup strategy, depending on your level of compliance need with various things. Maybe you work with financial data. Well, there's going to be certain levels of compliance that may be needed depending on that. And that kind of gets back into that backup of cloud data too. Oftentimes there's just as much sensitive information in the cloud. And what many people don't notice, because just like most of us, when you are going past those terms of service to whatever cloud organization that you're working with, a lot of those cloud platforms are going to state right in there that they're not responsible for the data that's on there, which means they don't have to back it up. It's your responsibility to back it up. They don't have to deal. If they have some sort of disaster, it's on you. It's not on them. sure, they have better systems in place to help prevent against some of that, but not to the degree that people trust their cloud providers. It is your responsibility. If you're using Gmail for your organization, so the Google Suite, Workspace Suite, or if you're using Microsoft 365 like we do, you have to make sure that you back those things up, because again, that can be easily all deleted and or ransomed by somebody. Locked out of your own stuff is a terrible place to be. And so making sure that you have access to that data in the cloud and are protecting it the same way that you would with a traditional backup of on-site data is important. The other thing that's really common in organizations is, are you keeping data at the end user device level? So their desktop or laptop that they're using, it should all be going to some sort of server-based environment. But all too often people save things in their documents folder, their downloads folder, their desktop. The desktop's the favorite place.
Yeah.
It's a land of chaos.
I'll find it easily.
Right. I'll find it. I know where it is. You know, there's, 100 icons on the desktop and you're trying to find something on there. But that also means that the data may not be backed up. So we actually have to talk about strategy around that, and strategy to make sure there's not important data that's being missed by a backup solution because, well, it's on Bob's laptop and it failed and we didn't have another copy of it. Now you're paying thousands of dollars to have specialized companies see if they can extract the data off of a failed drive. Worse yet, Bob has laptop stolen. Unless that is recovered by law enforcement, it's gone. Say goodbye to that data, and however important it was, you better have another strategy, because recovering the data isn't an option if it's not part of your backup strategy.
Well, we've raised everybody's blood pressure now. So how do we approach the solution here?
I think it's thinking about it holistically, meaning we want to think about the data everywhere and anywhere it could be, and then think about the strategies to limit people's ability to store it in places you don't want, and then think about how are we going to capture all of that data, put it in a backup, make sure it's safe, and then we're going to then talk about those recovery objectives and figuring out how fast certain systems or all of the systems need to be back up and operational. So having a comprehensive plan around that, here's the most important part, and this is the part that doesn't happen, but it is, and sometimes it's actually required on paper by compliance purposes, but still isn't done. You have to test it.
Oh.
It's one thing to actually have backup data, but if you don't test that, you have to simulate various types of failures of your systems and then prove that you could be back up and operational with that data, meeting that recovery objective.
Wow. And I presume that some organizations maybe don't even know how to go about that.
Right. And that's the thing. Or they may not have the manpower in-house because they're short-staffed in their tech, because most organizations really don't have quite the tech staffing that they should, or they don't have the expertise to execute something like that. And so they need somebody to come in and help do that testing and prove out that the things are going to work when not if, when this happens. I don't know of an organization that hasn't faced this at some level. We had a client just this week. One of their staff had deleted entire folders of data accidentally. It was a complete accident. I and speaking with them, absolutely understand how it happened. But we were able to recover all of that data for them, and we were able to do it, I think, within like 10 minutes.
Oh my!
So they didn't even really have much of a blip. But it could have been a really big blip if that wasn't able to be done. So it's those types of things that are important.
Well, and when you think about a server, a number of employees all accessing that server, a lot of cooks in those kitchens, this can happen.
Oh, for sure. And so you're not always even trying to recover from an actual disaster in the traditional sense of somebody or something destroyed my data. It could be a user accident. Oops. Or, oh, wow, I took that, spreadsheet with really valuable data and I overwrote it with a spreadsheet that doesn't have the data in it.
Can happen.
It can. I mean, Windows or Mac will warn you, do you want to overwrite this file? All it takes is one accidental yes, and oops, all that data is gone. But is it? And if you have the appropriate backup strategy in place, it may be as simple as a quick couple of commands and boom, the data's back.
So we've, over the last several episodes, talked about things that might be interpreted as more infrastructure related, structured cabling and things of that nature. But AE Tech Design can also help you sort out these backup strategies.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that we spend a lot of time working with our clients on, is making sure that they have good backups done appropriately, that are secure and tested to meet the objectives of that organization. And, it's something that we want to be able to sleep at night, and being in charge of other people's infrastructure, their backups, their data. Ultimately, we want to make sure it's safe. And the only way we can sleep well at night is having those things done well.
And in case you hadn't noticed, we're back to the planning part again, the design part, understanding the needs, the objectives, and coming up with a plan.
Absolutely.
All right, so Roger and his team are ready for you to reach out, and we can have a conversation about what that means for you and get that discussion started with AE Tech Design. Roger Forewarn, thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Little Blinking Light is our podcast. Subscribe. You'll be alerted when a new episode deploys. Thanks.
Thank you.